earlier described the fact that as many as 1,000 people sometimes sailed aboard one of these ships. And you can see that there was absolutely no room on the deck for everybody at one time, so the ship had several decks. Those below decks perhaps could have a turn on deck, but one can imagine what the living accommodations was like. The Hunsides had come earlier, and they were fortunate enough to secure passage on a ship that was partly powered by steam. The great age of the sailing ships was just now coming to an end. This ship here is an example of that type of vessel, which was the pride of the line in 1873 and was the biggest built at the time. Unfortunately, the article here goes on to relate that unfortunately this ship sunk in the stormy Atlantic. This is an example of a cabin in one of the first-class ships of the day, with all the emigrants dolled up in their Sunday best for this picture. You can see about what the accommodations were like here, and I'd like to contrast this with something. No, this isn't the first-class passage of a sailing ship. This is the interior of a Boeing 747 operated by the Scandinavian Air Service on the route across the Atlantic recently. Believe it or not, the fares are about the same in kroners. I believe that the modern day adventurer has it a little easier there with those cute little Norwegian stewardesses in attendant. As I mentioned, the fare then and the fare now was about the same, but of course the money was much more dear then. A passenger fare across the Atlantic was equal to the pay of a Norwegian legislator or congressman for approximately 5 months. This is an example of one of the lines and a ticket that I've photographed here just for our interest. That was really valuable to somebody. Here's another one of the a contract, as it's called, a passenger contract from the Cunard Steamship Company, which is still in business. Now, as we mentioned, the great age of the sailing ships was just coming to an end at this era. While the Hunsides family, being a pharmacist in Norway, probably had a little more money than the Shennums did for travel, had arranged a different class of travel. But Ole, our grandfather, had stayed behind and was working in Norway, most likely, here I'm surmising, saving up money to where he would have enough to make the trip, and came after his parents did. he recalled hearing about the assassination of President Lincoln while he was working in one of the little villages there called burgs for the first time as a burgher, working in one of the little burgs to apparently accumulate enough money to secure passage for himself. Hazards of the sea were plenty, with shipwreck and storm being the most dramatic, but the one that occurred to him, he told us about in 1928 when he visited our farm in northeastern Montana. I said that Grandpa Ole visited our farm in 1928. Actually, it was 1927, the year that I started to grade school. My brother Joe and I were discussing this recently. He vividly recalls the conversation, the story, just as I do. Our recollection of the facts differs slightly, which perhaps isn't too surprising when you think that it has been 60 years now since the story was told, and so we agree on the gist of it, and I'm going to tell you how it was. I remember the day sitting on the front porch of the shack, as we called it, which was a cool place to sit in the evening, and Grandpa Ole told us this story. When they set out from Norway, it was in a sailing ship, and the trip was intended to take a few weeks. It wasn't to turn out that way. Apparently, the voyage was pretty successful, and they were within sight of the North American continent, according to Joe's recollection of the story, when a storm drove them back, and they were driven back out to sea quite a distance. At which point, I remember Grandpa telling us about his experience. What happened next was a dread experience. The ship lost its wind and it became becalmed. Being a sailing ship, it was absolutely idle on the ocean. No motion whatsoever. The food supplies ran low. They got down to where the only thing they had left was salt pork and beans. According to Joe's recollection of the story, even that ran out. I don't recall that part. I do remember what he said about the people sickening on the diet and the terrible experience when people would regurgitate and vomit, and this would go from one deck down to the other. A horrible experience. If this sounds vulgar to talk about it, think about what it must have been to live through. They were on the ocean for weeks until a favorable wind was finally secured, and they put towards the coast again. The ship must have been blown north, because the story is that they landed in Canada, and the transportation being not that super. As Joe said, the 747s weren't running that day, and so his transportation to Minnesota was on foot. He walked. Grandpa told us some other incidents, and I've heard them repeated at other times by my father, of stories from Norway. One of the things he told us, that when he was working in Norway, he made $18 a year. None Another story that he told us that has always made me wonder was a story about a reflection in the sky. It was during one of the wars in Europe, I take it to be the Napoleonic Wars, although I don't know, when reflected in the sky was was one of the battles that was then going on in Europe, and visible in the sky was the horsemen and footmen, and all seemed to converge into one spot and then disappear. That was a strange saga, and perhaps someday we'll have an explanation for this. Another thing my dad told me about that time that I remember, it was a saga of Norway. It doesn't exactly fit here with the talk about the immigration and all, but it was a story about his grandfather that made speeches around Norway teaching agriculture and economics to the tenant farmers and the new farmers that were needing help getting going in the after the Industrial Revolution had hit, and teaching agriculture and agribusiness, I guess you'd say. And he gave speeches around the country, and he was so eloquent that when he would speak, that ladies in the audience would cry. This reminds me of something that I mentioned a little earlier in the film here, that Jens Hunseid was the president of Norway in 1932 to 1935. About 20 years ago, I picked up a Norwegian periodical when we were living in Missoula, Montana, and Jens Hunseid's picture was in there, along with a number of about 20 other Norwegian politicians. And it was a strange thing. Jens Hunseid, in his build and in his face, looked a great deal like our grandpa, Ole Larson. In fact, they could pass for being brothers. That was strange. The family had come under a strong influence of the Martin Luther Protestant Reformation, and my dad, John A. Shennum, had told me that his mother was a devout Christian, and which would lead to me to believe that her folks were too, and that the speeches that the family members made around the nation of Norway in connection with the government program of teaching agriculture and economics probably had a pretty strong Christian message as well. And this may have been why the ladies were moved to tears. My father had commented that he had heard his mother sing in the Spirit, and that she was a very strong Christian, and so that probably is worth mentioning. The family was members of the Lutheran Church for many years until homestead days in Montana, and I'll tell you about that somewhere along in the tape, why they left that particular denomination. Of some leaving forever had to be balanced by the promise of a better life in the New World. The immigrants, after an extremely tough ship, are shown here landing in port and preparing for the New World. We talked about the different passages available and looked at one shot of a first-class cabin. Here's another one, which is a rendition of a below decks where conditions were crowded, foul, and where privacy was non-existent. This would be more the class that most people came, although the Hun side seemed to have had things a little better. The circumstances of this immigration were hardly could be imagined, as I told you about Grandpa Shennum, Ole Shennum's passage over where the ship was becalmed and they were on the ocean for something like 7 months, a voyage which normally took about 4, and every conceivable type of sickness would occur on those crowded ships. Besides, it was almost impossible to have any cleanliness with water in such short supply. All the painful circumstances that you can imagine would occur. The lack of soap and washing facilities, and even the impossible toilet situation for the people, and the narrow space between the booths, which could hardly be kept clean. And this just made those who had to travel in this class, which was called steerage, to travel under the most abominable conditions that a person could travel under. I don't know what our earlier ancestors that came here in 1719 had in the way of facilities. It couldn't have been much better. But it's been said that when those hatchways were opened, the stench that would come out of there would rise like steam from a pig pen. And it was a dreadful state of affairs. The straw ticks and so forth, when they once got wet with seawater, soon rotted, and the room there in between the 2 rows of decks was very narrow. And I suppose that when a person ate or had their meals, they would have to sit on the bed to eat. A double bed was 3 feet by 6, and a single bed was probably 2 feet by 6. And there wasn't hardly any way to cook any food. There were some fireplaces fixed on the ship, but you can imagine with that many passengers what chance you'd have to do that. And so it's after this miserable condition that the passengers arrived in New York City, and you can well imagine the confusion and consternation of people arriving in a strange land and not knowing just where to go or what to do, and being confronted by all types of situations. Here is the earliest picture I have of Grandpa Ole Shennum in America. Standing to the right of him is his brother, who was also an immigrant and settled in Fillmore County. When Ole, or Grandpa Shennum as my generation knew him, landed in America, he joined his parents in Fillmore County. That's this county right here, a few miles south of Minneapolis, where what is now Minneapolis and St. Paul. He worked for a few years there at whatever work he could find in the agricultural community, and there he met the young woman that he later married, the little less than 5 foot tall Asa Marie Hunside. They bought a farm there and lived there for about 5 years. Word reached them, though, about the good land in rich farming country farther west, and they certainly were not mistaken about that. Ole went out there and to the community where he settled, which is Canby, near Canby, Minnesota, and filed on a homestead claim on a quarter of a section in Norman Township, where he was to be a township official for most of the rest of his life. He erected a small house there on the property, and that fall went back to Fillmore County and picked his wife and 2 small boys up in covered wagon and journeyed across country up towards what is now Mankato, and followed the course of the Minnesota River up to nearby Canby, and making this trip in a covered wagon. If you think life in the covered wagon is exciting, it may have been, but it certainly was not comfortable. If you can imagine living in this wagon bed and driving this kind of an outfit across the country for several days without the benefits, again, of any conveniences whatsoever, I think you'll begin to see that it was more hardship than it was adventure. A woman and 2 small children would be pretty well tied to the wagon box, and as far as sleeping and cooking and eating and riding, I believe that would get to be a pretty strenuous life. Those of you who have had an opportunity to live and ride in a wagon know that you feel every jolt, and that a spring seat, even though it does provide some relief, isn't much of an answer on those steel tires. The family lived on their claim for about 10 years, and then traded it for the farm which they lived on until their passing, and which for many years remained in the family until sold by one of the surviving girls who had spent her lifetime there, and at great personal sacrifice to take care of her old parents. The family prospered, and except for one infant by the name of Ludwig, who died in infancy, here is the family picture. Ole, Grandpa. Marie, Grandma. Pete. Ludwig, the next Ludwig. Bernhardt, Ben, who I am named after, and who my grandson Benjamin is named after. Herman, our first picture of John A. Shennum, my father, and Joe, who was later to farm with him in Montana. And then Alma, Emma, Lena, Anna, Selma, and guess who up there? The latest one, Norma.
What was that?
This little lady was our grandmother and did a big job of raising 12 children on that little farm. In those days, they spun their own wool. They raised the wool, they spun the wool, and they made the mittens and socks. They milked the cows and separated the milk and made cream, milk, and butter. And would you believe that this little lady got up before the rest of the family and then went out and milked the cows and brought in the milk before she fixed breakfast for the rest? If she has a grim look on her face under certain circumstances, I think I understand why. We had another picture of Grandpa Ole here, a man that everybody loved and who was kind and generous and really someone to be proud of. Our first picture of John A. Shennum, our father, here, who was looking just a little bit quizzically at the camera as if wondering who all is going to be looking at this and why is this picture being taken. J.M. Shennum, also a great favorite of ours. This is another, more of a family picture, obviously, and is a picture of the house that the family called home for so many years, and which is still standing there a few miles northwest of Canby, Minnesota. Many stories about this house, how the bees built nests in the house one year and the family was able to take a few of the siding boards off and have honey for the winter. There's a story that I'd like to tell you folks. You see this man right there who is the brother of Grandpa Shennum. Before they moved to the Canby area and before Ole was married to Asa, these two boys were out on the prairie and a huge prairie fire was coming their way and they had no way to protect themselves. Those of you who have seen a prairie fire know that the flames in that tall grass can reach 20 to 30 feet high in places, and when fanned by a good wind on a warm day, it's fierce to see. I've seen a fire like this. Some of you have. There's no escaping it with your life unless you're able to get beyond its reach. Well, there was no rivers, no way that these two fellows could get out of that forest fire, so your future, ladies and gentlemen of the Shennum family, was hanging in balance there. And they searched for matches which would save their lives by starting a backfire and could find no matches. They had no way to start a backfire and the fire was bearing down on them until one of the men found the head of a match stuck down beside the blades in his jackknife, and with the head of the match only managed to, with great care, get a fire started, create what is known as a backfire, and create a large burnt out spot where they could get onto and survive while the fire passed by. Life sometimes hangs by a slender thread. And this is one time when family the family's future hung by an extremely slender thread. I wonder how many other times in history this type of thing occurred. The Norwegian heritage had provided for our grandparents